All throughout high school and college, I often had people come and turn to me for advice on a number of fronts, mostly just as the resident guy that was going to be a pastor at some point in the future. And so people, thought that meant that I had some level of wisdom. And I, in high school and college, was more than happy to give people advice because at that point in my life, I was pretty convinced that I was the smartest guy in just about any room. So I had no problem telling people exactly what they needed to do to fix their problems. I did have this one friend, though, that she turned to me for advice very regularly. And without fail, she would, as soon as I would give her any advice, she would promptly go and do the exact opposite of what I told her to do. And so, this got a little irritating over the course of time because, I mean, honestly, even now looking back, I stand by a lot of the things that I told her to do, advised her to do. I think, she could have saved herself a lot of heartache over the years if she would have listened to my advice. But the issue is she never really internalized the advice that I gave her. She never really latched on to any of it because ultimately it was just me telling her what to do. Often I think one of the best things that we can do to help people figure things out and to make meaningful and long-lasting change in their life is to be very inquisitive, to ask a lot of questions, whether as a coach, a teacher, a counselor, or yes, even as a pastor. One of the best things that I think we can do is be inquisitive. I think that can be incredibly important in helping people see long-lasting change and growth in their own life. And the reason for this, at least in my opinion, and I recognize that I am in no way, shape, or form qualified to actually be making this assessment. This is just totally based off of my own experience and what I've noted in people over the years. But I really have come to believe that people respond better to things and to new ideas when they feel like they've come up with it themselves. And I see this even in my own life. If I go to my counselor and ask him, hey, how do I fix problem XYZ, and he just gives me the answer, well, then it's my choice at that point whether or not to take his advice. And it's just another guy telling me what to do. I can listen, I cannot. It doesn't really make a huge difference to him. But on the flip side, if I ask him, hey, how do I fix problem XYZ, and we talk through it, he's still fully capable of leading me to the answer that he wants me to get to by just asking questions, and helping me to process through things in my own mind, helping me to come up with the solution myself. And then if I feel like I come up with that solution myself, then I've got a much higher level of buy-in to that idea. And so I'm sure there's some deeper psychological idea that feeds into this that I'm not aware of because I'm not a psychology major. But I've just experienced this so many times, again, not only in my own life, but in the life of others as well, that I just am really convinced that we hang on to things longer, hold on to them tighter, and have a higher level of buy-in when we come up with ideas ourselves. And I believe that Mark, the author of the second gospel, knew this idea to be true as well. Because his entire gospel, while still centered on Jesus and his character and who he is, what he did, that whole book, though, still makes a strong case, the book does make a strong case for Jesus being king and Messiah, but that whole book is also focused on continually asking the question of just who Jesus is, just who we say that Jesus is. And implicitly, it cries out for the readers to make a decision for themselves, to make a declaration for themselves about who they say that Jesus is. As always, we've got two underlying assumptions for us as we work through this series on the gospel over the next year. So our first underlying assumption is that the gospel is Jesus. The gospel is that Jesus, the crucified and risen Messiah, is Lord. This is the good news. Jesus is the good news that we proclaim to the world. Our King Jesus is the good news, and everything else that we believe flows out of that core truth. The second assumption is this: it's that the Bible is a unified story that leads to Jesus. And so if Jesus is the gospel, then the whole Bible is leading to and pointing toward the gospel. And that's why this series is so important for us. We need to understand where and how it is that the Bible, not that we can ever, find an end to this list, but where are the ways in which each book of the Bible points to Jesus, points to the good news, or points to our need for him? So we're continuing our series on the gospel today in the gospel according to Mark. And so a little bit of background on this book as we jump in today. So Mark was written by a man who we otherwise know as John Mark, who was a companion of both Peter and Paul at various points in their life. Tradition tells us that Mark's gospel was composed of various stories and teaching that he had received from Peter over the years, as he was a traveling partner and companion of Peter for many years. And so Mark then took the stories and lessons that Peter taught over the years and compiled them into his book, and the book that we now know as the Gospel of Mark. The book was written sometime probably between 50 and 70 AD, making it likely the first gospel that was written. The most common suggestion for the original timing and purpose of the gospel is that it was, because of Mark's connection to Peter, he then had some connections to Rome and the church there. And so it was probably written to that church in Rome sometime in the early 60s during the height of Nero's persecution of Christians. And so it was in this moment of intense suffering and persecution for the church that Mark sought to give the church and Christians at large a reminder of who it was that they were suffering for, why it was that they were suffering, and the fact that suffering is a part of the journey that Christ calls us to. So Mark structures his book with three main movements. The first 8 chapters are Jesus and his disciples in Galilee, and it's times of teaching and performing miracles there closer to home. Then there's a brief block of text from the end of chapter 8 to the end of chapter 10 that kind of is a transition point as Jesus gets on the road and travels from Galilee to Jerusalem. And then chapters 11 to 16 take place in Jerusalem, and those chapters represent the conflict finally coming to a head between Jesus and the religious leaders, which then, of course, ultimately culminates in his arrest, crucifixion, death, and then resurrection on Easter Sunday. And so Mark does tell us at the beginning of his gospel who he believes that Jesus is. The very first verse of the Gospel of Mark says, "The beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God." But that's it. That's the only time that Mark ever really makes a declaration about who he believes Jesus to be. That's the only time he ever really inserts his own opinion into things. Otherwise, he just tells the story and kind of allows people to respond in their own way based on the words and actions of other people that were there with Jesus himself. He leaves the response ultimately up to the reader, even though he does have a bias and he declares who he believes Jesus to be. But the rest of the book, then, he wants the readers to look at this story and to make a declaration for themselves of who they say Jesus is. So the first section of the book not only talks about the ministry that Jesus is doing, but it also talks a great deal about how people respond to what he's doing. So there are many different responses. Some people willingly follow Jesus quickly and easily. Mark 1:16-20 says this: "As Jesus walked beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and his brother Andrew casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. 'Come, follow me,' Jesus said, 'and I will send you out to fish for people.' At once they left their nets and followed him. And when he had gone a little farther, he saw James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John in a boat, preparing their nets. And without delay he called them, and they left their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired men and followed him." So some people quickly and easily follow Jesus. It's not a question for these 4 men, and they then continue to stick with him, of course, through the rest of his ministry. But then there are others they're impressed by Jesus, but they're unsure about him. So the story then continues in Mark 1, verses 21-28, and it says this: "They," so Jesus and the disciples that he just called, "they went to Capernaum. And when the Sabbath came, Jesus went into the synagogue and began to teach. And the people were amazed at his teaching, because he taught as one with authority, not as the teachers of the law. And just then a man in the synagogue who was possessed by an impure spirit cried out, 'What do you want with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God.' 'Be quiet,' Jesus said sternly. 'Come out of him.' The impure spirit shook the man violently and came out of him with a shriek. The people were all so amazed that they asked each other, 'What is this? A new teaching and with authority?' And he even gives orders to impure spirits, and they obey him." News about him spread quickly over the whole region of Galilee. So there are those like the disciples that they just up and follow Jesus, but then there are those like the story we just heard that were in the synagogue with Jesus that they question. They're not sure who Jesus is. They're trying to figure him out. But then, of course, we know that there are also those who just outright reject Jesus and actively work against him through the course of the story. So Mark 3:1-6 says this: "Another time Jesus went into the synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal on the Sabbath. Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, 'Stand up in front of everyone.' Then Jesus asked them, 'Which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save or to kill?' But they remained silent. He looked around at them in anger and, deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts, said to the man, 'Stretch out your hand.' He stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. Then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus." And so, again, we've got the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the religious leaders at large, the Herodians, many others, that they do reject Jesus and are actively opposed to him and of course, actively working toward finding a way to kill him. But I think often we overlook the fact that it's not just them. We all know that the Pharisees and Sadducees are opposed to Jesus. We talk about that all the time. We know that they're the bad guys in the story. But they're not the only ones that reject Jesus. They're not the only ones that say no to this good news that he has for the world. Mark 6:1-16 tells us another story of a different group of people. So it says, "Jesus left there and went to his hometown, accompanied by his disciples. And when the Sabbath came, he began to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him were amazed. 'Where did this man get these things?' they asked. 'What's this wisdom that he's been given? What are these remarkable miracles he's been performing? Isn't this the carpenter? Isn't this Mary's son, the brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon? Aren't his sisters here with us?' And they took offense at him. And Jesus said to them, 'A prophet is not without honor except in his own town, among his relatives, in his own home.' And he could not do any miracles there, except lay his hands on a few sick people and heal them. He was amazed at their lack of faith. Then Jesus went around teaching from village to village." So again, it's not just the Pharisees and Sadducees. It's even Jesus' hometown. It's people like us, people that are just everyday people that were waiting for the Messiah, and they missed it and were opposed to Jesus. And in the case of those in his hometown, their lack of faith in him then prevented him from even being able to do some of the miracles that he had done in other places. And yet, Jesus is not surprised by these responses. He is not surprised by the varied response, which is exactly the point of a different parable that Jesus tells in the Gospel of Mark. And this parable is located at the very center point of the first half of the book. So remember, we talked about kind of three different sections, and chapter 1-8 of Mark is that first section of it, that he's in Galilee and he's teaching. And so the very center point, the point that we're supposed to focus on in that section, is this parable. So Mark 4:3-8 says this: "Listen, a farmer went out to sow his seed. As he was scattering the seed, some fell along the path, and the birds came and ate it up. Some fell on rocky places where it did not have much soil. It sprang up quickly because the soil was shallow. But when the sun came up, the plants were scorched, and they withered because they had no root. Other seeds fell among thorns, which grew up and choked the plants so that they did not bear grain. And still other seed fell on good soil. It came up, grew, and produced a crop, some multiplying 30, some 60, and some 100 times." Jesus knows, as we should as well, that the good news that is shared with the world will bring about a variety of responses to it. But all we can do is share the message. All we can do is cry out and call to people and show them the good news that we've experienced, and then wait and see how they respond. We cannot convince people to believe. We cannot twist their arm into belief. Our job is simply to sow and see where the seed lands. And that's it. God brings about the growth. So that's the center point of the first half of the book, but then the center point of the book at large is this other story, this transition point from Jesus being in Galilee to Jesus in Jerusalem and his final conflict. But this center point is when they're on the road to Jerusalem, And Jesus explicitly asks this famous question that has reverberated throughout the ages and continues to be asked of each and every person today. Who do you say that I am? Mark 9:27-30 says this. Jesus and his disciples went on the village around Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he asked them, who do people say that I am? They replied, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others one of the prophets. But what about you, he asked, who do you say that I am? And Peter answered, you are the Messiah. Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. And this is clearly what Mark is trying to get all of his readers to understand and confess through the story that he's telling. He wants all of his readers to confess that Jesus is the Messiah. And on the one hand, this is the center point of the Gospel of Mark, and this is good and exciting news for the world. And we finally get this first acknowledgement from the disciples of just who Jesus is, and they finally declare it. Peter says the right words, that he's the Messiah. That's great. Except that it's promptly made very clear that Peter doesn't actually understand what he's saying. The story continues in verse 31-38. He says, Jesus then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and on the third day rise again. He spoke plainly about this, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But when Jesus turned and looked at the disciples, he rebuked Peter. Get behind me, Satan, he said. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. Then he called the crowd along with him and his disciples, and he said, whoever wants to be my disciple must first deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world and yet forfeit their soul? Peter said the right words, that Jesus is the Messiah. But what Peter doesn't understand is the implications of that messianic role. Peter believes that the way in which Jesus will save them will be through violence and conquest and victory over their enemies. And so, of course, it does not make sense for Jesus to talk about being killed and rising again. And then, of course, Peter's rebuke of Jesus makes a lot more sense in that context. If he believes that Jesus has to be alive to actually conquer the enemies, then yeah, it's going to be a pretty hard message for him when Jesus tries to say that he's going to die. So I think this section of Mark is an interesting contrast between our words and our belief. Peter said the right words, you are the Messiah. That was the right answer. Great, we think to ourselves, okay, he gets it. Except he absolutely doesn't get it, because then when Jesus unpacks the implication of being the Messiah, Peter about loses his mind. And this is the thing with our faith, especially in our world today. We can say the right words and still not actually understand. We can say that Jesus is Messiah and Lord and not have a clue what that actually means. If it happened to Peter, then why could the same not be true in our life? So Mark, throughout the rest of the gospel, then goes on to demonstrate exactly what it is for Jesus to be the Messiah. He goes on to demonstrate Jesus' sacrificial, upside-down kingdom that he is ushering in. And he shows us what Jesus truly means as he says he's the Messiah. Yes, being the Messiah means victory over enemies, but the victory comes through his own death, not the death of his enemies. And his victorious throne takes the shape not of a castle, but of a cross. And the enemy that he defeats is not the Romans or the Pharisees or the sinners, but it's death itself. Now, as a small aside, today is the second Sunday of Advent, and so today we light the candle of peace. And we talk about peace a lot, and I think peace is important, but our understanding of peace, what we mean when we say peace, like a lack of conflict is kind of our implication when we say peace, is not at all what the word peace meant in an Old Testament context. Peace for the Old and New Testament both means not just to have a lack of conflict, but to bring about reconciliation and to bring things back together into wholeness. And so this is why we celebrate peace as a part of Advent, is that this is what Christ brings to us. When Rome or any other nation or ruler came to bring peace, they brought it through violence and conquest and domination of their enemies and forced submission to their power. But that is not true peace in any sense of the word, let alone a biblical sense of the word. But Jesus' kingdom, Jesus' way of living is not just to bring about a lack of conflict, but it's to bring about a kingdom that brings restoration. It makes enemies into friends. It can mend even the relationship between us and God himself. Jesus' kingdom restores God's peace and wholeness as he intended it at the very beginning in creation into the world. And you know who the first person to realize this is? Just who Jesus is, just what it is for him to be the Messiah, just what it means for him to be bringing peace into the world. You know who the first person in the book of Mark is to acknowledge this and acknowledge that they understand who Jesus is, that he's a different kind of king in this story? It's not Peter. It's not even any of the other disciples. It's not even Jesus' mother, Mary. It's the Roman centurion who oversaw Jesus' crucifixion. Mark 15 tells us this: with a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And when the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus saw how he died, he said, "Surely this man was the Son of God." This centurion goes a step farther than any of the disciples ever did and declares that Jesus is more than just another man, but the Son of God. And clearly there's some irony in this part of Mark's story that even after all of the signs and wonders that Jesus did, the Jews never got it. The first person to really understand who Jesus was a pagan Roman centurion who helped to kill him. As I've mentioned before, then, the book of Mark ends after this in a very curious way. The original ending of the book, the way that Mark likely intended for it to end, happens in this way. So Mark 16, 1-8 says this: when the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they might go and anoint Jesus' body. Very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb, and they asked each other, "Who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb?" But when they looked up, they saw the stone, which was very large and had been rolled away. And as they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe standing on the right side, and they were alarmed. "Don't be alarmed," he said. "You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go and tell his disciples and Peter, he's going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. And that's where the book of Mark ends. The women running away, bewildered and afraid from an empty tomb. Feels like a pretty abrupt and strange ending for a book that's supposed to be about sharing the good news for all of the world. But I think this is the final way in which Mark brings us back around to one of his main points, the question that's asked in the very center point of the book: who do you say that Jesus is? And perhaps implicitly, how are you going to respond? The whole book of Mark declares the wonder of Jesus, of who Jesus is, and cries out for us to respond, calling for us to declare who we believe that he is. And even more than that, then cries out for us to answer the question of what are we going to do about it? Who are we going to tell? How are we going to be different because of this message? If Jesus is our Messiah and Lord, should we not go out and tell the world with gladness and rejoicing? Should we not share the good news that Christ has given us, that he has come to bring full and complete peace to this world? Because this is the gospel that Christians believe, that Jesus, the crucified and risen Messiah, is Lord. So what are you going to do about it?